emergency manager, and then 15 years of doing remote sensing and geospatial intelligence in various guises. I've done close to 50 major disasters around through the Pacific and then through the Atlantic and across the United States. Honestly, so many of them that I couldn't tell you the numbers. The bulk of my work has been in the geospatial intelligence side of emergency management, wherein we use all these fancy, wonderful, magical tools to make actionable decisions that save lives. That's the crux of the tech that we use. Is it has to serve a purpose. It has to serve the operational objectives of what we are doing. So the first thing to look at in context of this talk is speaking about the operational area in question. So my understanding is that the operational area is in the Western Pacific, near the islands collectively known as Tonga, and involving a volcanic eruption. Is that correct? Before I walk any further and stick my foot in my mouth?
It is, yes.
Excellent. So a little bit of background. I have worked in several remote incidences on islands, both island nations as well as remote communities on continents as well. So Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and a few others that I'm not going to bore you or try to pronounce because my tongue is bad. But in that capacity, did urban search and rescue, support and intelligence, incident support teams, helped with planning, evacuations, all kinds of things. In this case, the operational area is a very remote area. In fact, it's very close to the Nemo point, or the area that is the farthest from any other landmass. So getting things in and out of Tonga is difficult. This is just an obvious thing. So that makes it very appealing to be able to, especially an area that could potentially be outside of communication or have difficult communication, difficulty getting logistics in and out. How do we identify the situation on the ground, and get that coupled with some local knowledge, make a plan for how to proceed to meet our objectives, or even identify what our objectives should be. Whenever you are identifying an incident, one of the things that we look for on the remote sensing side of things is what are we looking at? On the island of Tonga and most other islands, things that are crucially important are sources of water, ability to transport, sources of food, medical care, power, same as you would find in other places, except they can't really borrow from the neighboring island, electricity necessarily, or it's difficult to transport large quantities of fresh water. It's difficult to transport medical supplies and other things, especially if critical infrastructure such as the port is damaged, or an airport. One of the things that in my capacity in geospatial intelligence, oftentimes is a flight happens during or after or immediately following a disaster, is identifying whether or not the airport is functional. We generally use what we would consider a quick and dirty method of a plane with a camera. Sometimes that's all you need is if you can get a plane with a camera over the site, no matter who it's from, you can start making some actionable decisions. That is considered a remotely sensed product. Is just a simple photo from an aircraft. And honestly, that's how the entire field started, is people taking pictures from, as long as there's been pictures and as long as there's been balloons or pigeons or planes, people have been doing that and trying to make decisions based off the information that they've received. So now that we've kind of gotten into the start of what a remotely sensed thing is, well, let's talk about what a directly sensed thing is. A directly sensed product is something that you're actually physically touching. So in this case, buoys are an excellent example of platforms that carry instruments that directly sense the pressure the movement and overall temperature of the ocean that they're surrounding. In this particular incident, that's incredibly important for things such as tsunami detection, wherein the direct measurement of deep sea changes in pressure and in vector and velocity and many other things can inform whether or not a community thousands of miles away could be affected by this event that is altogether very remote. Yes, the people of New Zealand, how much they care about the Tonga eruption, they care quite a bit, especially about 10 minutes after. Wherein people on the eastern side of the Pacific have a little bit of more time to think about whether or not they care. And part of what direct remote sensing is creating products for stakeholders so that they can make actionable decisions or decide whether or not they need to act at all. How many times is there a volcanic eruption, a potential tsunami is detected, and then later on, another buoy down the line says, hey, this area of Alaska, you don't have to worry about it today. Today's not your day, you're good. That is just as important as giving the word out to evacuate, because we can't shut down our lives every time something happens. So we need to be able to move forward. Going back to remote sensing is looking at things from far away, using generally changes in the detection, reflection, or absorption of radiation or emissions, energy, usually in the form of light or microwaves or even sound waves, to make determinations about the condition of the thing that we are detecting on the other side. So that can be what material that surface that we are detecting is made of. It can just be a visual in the visual spectrum of the status of a solar farm. It can be just using a normal camera. It can be using advanced lasers and computers to detect changes in elevation to determine whether or not a landslide has occurred beneath a thick jungle canopy and may be affecting residents below that canopy. These are all things that we can detect remotely, but there are limitations. And the limitations of a remotely sensed and even a directly sensed product are just as important as what it can do, is what it can't do and when it can't do that. Can anybody, one of the things who's familiar with Google Earth? Just show of hands. Google Earth introduced aerial photography and satellite photography to an entire, just millions of people that had never had an idea of, I can see my house from here, from this very freely accessible product that provided by a very large company. But for a lot of people, that was their first thing. Maybe the world is a little bit bigger than we anticipated. Or that I never had to think about the world as a series of pictures stitched together on a globe. For our purposes, we should. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. That same resource can provide a baseline for what normal might be in that particular area. So knowing where we're starting from is a good place to start. So developing our operational objectives, we can look at base imagery for an area, whether that be freely available through Google or a NGO, or whether we could pay for that photography and establish, okay, what is normal supposed to look like? And then once we have that baseline, we can establish what's going on now. So immediately following an event, we would take additional photographs. We would use our additional sensors to try and get a new, where are we starting from now? What is the new, what's damaged, what's not damaged, what's functional, what's not functional, how are people responding? We start to ask those questions and start to look for answers. So before I get too much into the really, there is, especially remotely sensed, is expensive. that is the number one rule, is that somebody is paying for this somewhere. In coming from the United States, we're kind of spoiled for choice when it comes to remotely sensed platforms. A lot of that is freely available. It takes time to get it to the public, but that is something that a lot of American emergency managers don't understand. Is when you work outside of those borders, you have to have those relationships, or else you don't get the data. You don't get the, you need to have understandings, agreements, memorandums in place, payment schedules. Even within the United States, two agencies that want to use each other's satellite platforms for a purpose, they pay each other. They transfer from one budget to another through a mission assignment to get that data that is actionable for their purpose. Or to fly a particular mission to scan something, or to send a ship out to do remote detection, or put a microphone in the water. So yes, relationships, basically the operational efficiency of getting remotely sensed and directly sensed information starts with people. There's nothing that you can get that you won't have to ask somebody for. Stuff doesn't just pop out of, come for free. People always want something. Let's say in Puerto Rico, I received all kinds of different data from all over the world. And I was like, great, this is awesome. And they're like, awesome, where can we send the invoice? And it's like, I'll get back to you. Working remotely, or in some of the Native American reservations in California, within their borders, there were some wildfires, and we were dealing with that, and then the ongoing aftermath of some landslides. And I had an offer from a Russian operator of several satellites to use their near infrared technology to help us delineate the fire. And I was like, okay, how much is this going to cost me? And they're like, oh, you already know that question. To begin with, know your budget, know what you can spend, know what you can't spend, and know who to call. So we always say in emergency management, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. None of us can do this alone. And we have to know who to call, or know somebody who knows somebody who to call to get the requests. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is not going to be you post-processing LiDAR data to provide actionable intelligence. That is not what I'm doing. If I was training somebody to take my job, that would be what I would do. But in this case, I want to help you understand what you should ask for, who you should ask for, so that you can ask for the right resolution to meet your objective, that you can get it in a timely manner, that you can store it and get it to stakeholders in a way that is functional for them. You can have the best imagery in the world, but if the file is huge and you're on a remote island with very little communications, it doesn't do you any good. Or if you don't have a computer that can process it, or you don't have an analyst that can process it, raw data is very often useless or counterproductive at the very best. So some of the first questions that we have to determine is, do we have the capability to process this on site or not? If we don't, we better call our friends, whoever they may be, wherever they may be. I'm also a member of EURISA, which is focused on geospatial practitioners. There is a group called the GIS Core, and they do volunteer GIS operations to help with disasters and catastrophes and ongoing events, droughts. They also do remote sensing help. And if you are shorthanded and you can put there is a way to formally request help from these volunteers, and they will mobilize to help you. But you gotta know what you want. They can give you lots, but if it doesn't help your objective, then you wasted a favor, perhaps. So So you have to identify what you need first. And then, and sometimes it's just, I need to know what the hell is going on right now. And maybe something quick and dirty will work. That may not help later on in an incident. Or maybe you need to know, is anything actively on fire? That I can help you day or night. You can see fires from space. They're pretty easy to see. And you can use infrared sensors to do that. You can also see them from a boat or from a plane or from a drone, depending on what you have on hand. You can have the best technology in the world, but if it isn't working and if it isn't in your area when you need it, it doesn't serve you any good. So I will quit bantering for a moment, and let's get a little bit into some things about remote indirect sensing. There is a process to remote indirect sensing that is pretty across the board. You don't have to worry about any one tech versus another. They all follow the same basic process. And that is you place an order or you place a request with the specifications for what you need. That is then acquired through whatever platform and instrument they have available that meets that need. It gets pre-processed, it gets corrected. That is an important piece to make it usable. And then it is interpreted either manually or digitally using an algorithm to give you something that is actionable. And they deliver to you a product in a form that you can receive. If you have no power and you have no digital goods, sometimes that is just a bunch of paper maps that come in by airdrop, or by the next shipment of food, or whatever you can get. If you have a satellite phone, sometimes that is somebody conveying through communications, the information that you were asking about. Is this operational? Is this operational? How bad off are the trees on this side? Does it look like we're going to have to clear that road? Sometimes it's just somebody on the other end of a radio. Sorry, got a little lost in my notes there. So, and just like any other request, the stuff that is unsolicited, that falls off the back of a truck and ends up in your lap and in your court from gracious benefactors who may want to get paid later, you have to know what to do with that data as well. Does that serve your operational needs? Can you cancel a previous order because of this data that is here right now? Does it meet your requirements? Okay. Can anyone tell me what resolution is when it comes to photography?
Isn't it like the quality of the picture and how much you can see in detail if you zoom or zoom out?
Yeah, exactly. So take your profile picture, for example, on social media. If it's a pixelated mess, people may not be able to tell who you are. You need sufficient resolution to meet your objective of them knowing who you are. Let's look at filters. What are filters in that context? Can they raise resolution? Can they help cover some things that you feel aren't important, like like my buck teeth or whatever it might be? That is a type of post-processing. So there's all these things that we're familiar with, but once the images are enormous, millions of pixels, millions and millions and millions of pixels, resolution is important. So there's two types of resolution that matter to us. Spatial resolution, which is the size of the pixels themselves on the Earth, and spectral resolution. What frequencies of light or other energy are we seeing in that moment? So for spatial resolution, the things that we focus on, the higher the resolution, the smaller the pixel size. So for a 10-meter resolution 10 meters is about 33 feet or 35 feet, and 35 foot by 35 foot square may not be helpful if you're trying to determine if you're trying to count cars in a parking lot or something. But that may be a useful resolution for fires, landslides, magma. In this case, because the islands that we're dealing with are fairly small and remote from one another, a larger resolution is not going to help us. We need a finer resolution to identify what we're looking at. So something in the neighborhood of a 3-foot resolution, where if I painted a 3-foot by 3-foot white square on the ground, you could tell what it is. That helps for identifying number of cars. Is there a boat blocking a port? Is there, are we able to meet the objectives that we need to meet? It gives you enough information without being too. If I had like 1-inch resolution, it's basically like I'm, somebody's stalker from space. That also might not be useful in this particular incident, because we're sure we get a lot of detail, but it will take a lot of time to process. It will also take a lot of bandwidth, a lot of resources, a lot of algorithmic time in a very fast set of computers to do the work that we need to do. So, don't ask for the highest resolution you have. That's a quick way to get a whole lot of data that you can't use. You end up downsampling it anyway to try to print it out. I have known people that have requested high quality imagery. They get it in and then they print it out on a photocopier, and it doesn't do anything. And they try to hand the maps or the images out to people in helicopters to try and rescue people. That is not. You have to know the limitations of all of the technology in your chain to try and get something actionable. In that case, I would say, hey, you should probably talk to the GIS person. They can probably get you something that's printable. That would be much more functional for that particular operation. So spectral resolution, there are frequencies of light and radiation and emissions from the Earth and from the sun reflecting off of the Earth that are outside of our ability to see. Things like the near infrared spectrum, which is very helpful in sensing heat. Also in sensing the whether or not plants are growing well. They reflect differently depending on the health of plants. Oftentimes after a disaster, plants are having a really rough time, especially after a volcanic event where they're all covered in ash. That is actually using near infrared sensors can be a great way to see the current status of ash on top of plants. So as the ash washes off through rainfall or is blown off with wind, you will begin to see the near infrared spectrum begin to show up more intensely in areas where the vegetation has begun to recover. That can give you good information about, okay, maybe the ash in other areas is starting to to dissipate as well or be blown away. That can also show you near infrared and some other bands can also be used to determine the health or the content of water reservoirs. In the case of some Indonesian volcanoes, you're able to very clearly see before and after of a reservoir, and through some post-processing, you can determine that the ash had begun to acidify the reservoir to the point where they were going to have to make corrections in their water treatment to keep the water safe. These are maybe not the first things we think of, but they are capabilities that are in your arsenal that you can look at. So other things, landslides, usually expose bare earth. Bare earth reflects differently than, say, vegetation or concrete or asphalt or water. Areas that collect water will also reflect differently, and you will be able to see that through sources of multispectral imagery. Multispectral imagery oftentimes has multiple areas of light, both visible and non, that are applied in a photograph. Oftentimes we do three visible bands in a photograph representing red, green, and blue RGB, like you would see on your telephone or your iPhone or your TV using those pixels. In the same way, we can apply red, green, and blue to these different other bands, seen and not, and make some interpretations. Oftentimes, if you Google multispectral imagery right now, you'll see a bunch of photos that look pink and blue and some weird colors that grass isn't supposed to be, and that's because the color has been applied to things that are normally not visible. So also infrared camera film, if y'all remember what camera film is, will also show a different hue when developed under a color developer. Okay, so we talked about reflectance and emissions and different things that we can do with that. How are these things carried? Planes, ships, satellites, buoys, fixed ground stations that just have a camera on top of them, helicopters, UAVs, and even unmanned surface vessels have all been utilized in disaster recovery operations in the last 10 years. Can anybody tell me what an unmanned surface vessel is?
Is it like a drone?
It is a boat drone or a submarine drone. A lot of times we think about remote sensing in the form of, from the top down. Sometimes you need a side view, and that's perfectly acceptable to use a ship or a car if that's applicable to get you some photos that you can work with. Sometimes you don't need to fly a plane, you don't need to commission a satellite to get you information. Sometimes there's just a boat in the area. Social media is great for this. We talk about crowdsourcing as a means of getting ground truth photos. You can actually take those ground truth photos, apply them over a three-dimensional surface for elevation, like splattering paint, and you can process images that way, knowing which direction they're facing, and that can give yourself a very good color map of what things are looking like. And you'll see gaps where there aren't photos, but there is tech that is currently in place, algorithms that are in place, that if you can get cell phone footage from people, you can create actionable, almost the equivalent of aerial photography that you can work from. The problem in this particular instance is that comms is still cell phone coverage, satellite phone coverage, even internet, is in flux. So those are things to consider when you're looking at the different platforms that these instruments reside on. So are all planes that have instruments the same? No, because there's different, I alluded to the different bands and the different things that you can see that are in the visual spectrum and not. So there's also, there's different types of instrument packages, oftentimes that can be interchanged on aircraft and on ships and on drones to get you what you need. So in my experience, I worked a lot with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. They had a very large aircraft that they loved to use during disasters, where they would take nadir, which is NADIR, which is basically straight up and down photos, straight down, and ortho photos, which are off to the side. And the combination of those photos, they would post online. I will post that resource before the end of the class. It's actually really great. So every hurricane and that has hit the United States and its territories and surrounding partners in the last, I believe, 10 years, they have all of that aerial photography up and freely available, incredibly high resolution. And I counted on them for most disasters for a number of years until I was in the Florida Keys and the plane broke. That suddenly was no longer helpful to me as an emergency management professional and as somebody who was trying to get products to helicopter pilots to rescue people. I had to rely on other sources. Problem is, I had lost the phone numbers for 2 of the people that I would normally have contacted, and it took me another 12 hours to get a hold of them. So the relying too much on one particular resource, I would not recommend. Definitely utilize all of your partners as you can, so you don't fall into the trap of relying too much on one or another. The same goes for satellites. I've often used the GOES and SPOT and Iconos satellite systems, even though their resolution may not be that high. Used together, you can enrich that data into something that's actionable. The problem is, whenever I was in Puerto Rico doing search and rescue operations there after both hurricanes Irma and Maria hit, was that there was a solar storm, and it knocked out my satellite link for 3 days. It was not great. So I had an admiral that was screaming down my neck that he needed imagery, and I couldn't give it to him simply because the satellite would not send uncorrupted data through its link with us. It just wasn't happening. Military satellites were having the same problem. There was a big storm. And space weather is not something you often think about when you're doing your daily job, but in remote sensing, it's something we deal with a lot. It can also affect how the image is taken and how you receive the data on the other end. You will see kinds of crazy artifacts where things that are supposed to be green are blue and things that are supposed to be red are blue. They're brighter or darker. Solar storms are very
curious to know.
I was in a very particular, I was a mission assigned FEMA employee working under the response directorate, mission assigned to the US Urban Search and Rescue incident support teams. And normally that seat is taken by a member of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They have much higher clearance than I did, and they work with the military constantly. I did not have that luxury, so I was put in contact with some great people who I'm pretty sure they did not give me their real name, and they were able to smooth some things over and make it so that the FEMA liaisons in Washington were talking to the DoD liaisons and making sure we weren't breaking any laws by using military assets on civilian recovery. There are laws that apply to the both nationally and internationally about the application of military and civilian imagery technologies in different situations. So knowing those laws is helpful. In this particular case, it was when I first got to Hurricane Harvey and was doing urban search and rescue there. The only military contact I had was with the helicopter pilots I was working with and their air command. As that 2017 season progressed, going on into doing remote support for Guam and USVI, stuff would fall off the back of a truck and end up in our queue with a lot of identifying markers scraped off. So I don't know what intelligence agencies gave me those, but I appreciated it. But I also, it wasn't what I was asking for, so it wasn't necessarily meeting our operational objectives. So then I had it taking up storage in my limited hard drive that I had at the time. So storage and backup, another thing to consider. Remote and direct sensed technologies require a lot of data. They require a lot of bandwidth. They require beefy computers most of the time. If you can outsource that to somewhere safe that has a better internet connection than you, I would certainly do that. So make use of offers from mainland partners, to whether that's the ANZAC countries in this particular case, who I've worked with in the past, who are very helpful, or even the beautiful thing about digital collection of remote sensed and direct sensed data is, as long as you've got a good connection, somebody in Iceland can be helping you. And that's entirely fine. It's just getting that data back to you in a usable form takes a little bit more time than you'd probably like. Which is also to say there's no shame in FedExing a hard drive from one side of the world to the other. Oftentimes they can get places that you can't. So, you know, investigate that particular avenue. I've been offered, I was offered satellite imagery from a Chinese platform one time. That was in support of another incident. And we had to refuse because there are US laws that mean that US and Chinese space entities cannot communicate with one another. I forget which act it is, but you can't exchange data in that way. It's against the law. So we had to politely decline, but you know, definitely sent them an appreciation card anyway. So once we get into, so we've talked a little bit about processing and interpretation. Stuff that comes directly out of a camera or directly out of a satellite is often not usable in its current form. The lenses and things that are used to collect this data and the instrument packages oftentimes will distort the data because it's like a big fisheye lens. The corners will be a different distance than the center will be, and that all has to be accounted for. Thankfully, most satellite operators will do that for you, and most aircraft operators will do that for you as well, because they're familiar with their own packages. They will process that information. It just takes time. So we've talked about this process from ordering all the way through processing, and now we're about to get into interpretation. The first thing to know is that it takes time to do that entire process and to do it over and over and over again. You're never just asking for one product. There's, you know, you always want more, and eventually they'll start saying no. But while you have their goodwill, ask for it and ask for it often. Make sure that they know your name. Make sure that they know what you need and that you're very thankful for what they're providing you and who's paying, and that you know the process and know how long it's going to take, so that you can communicate to your stakeholders, whether that's the pilots doing rescue missions, whether that's the tanker ships that are going to be providing fuel at the port to refuel the island, you know, whether or not that's the electrical contractors who will be coming in to try and repair solar farms and residential power stations. You know, you need to be able to communicate to them when they're going to receive that information so that they can act and they can provide actionable plans to their people. So sometimes it can be several hours. Sometimes it can be several days. Sometimes it can be weeks. I made a request during during Hurricane Maria, and they're like, "Great, we'll get it to you in 3 days." Awesome, I can deal with that. I was no longer deployed in that incident 3 months later, and I received a call going, "Hey, we can't find you. Where do you want this data?" I was like, "Guys, I needed that 88 days ago." But they eventually delivered. It just was no longer helpful. So, you know, there's always the saying, better late than never. When it comes to imagery, not necessarily. If it's no longer actionable, it's now just burning up resources, it's taking up space, and you're still accountable for paying for it a lot of the time. So make sure that you're in active communication with the people that are providing you the information. And if they are having trouble, it's okay to cancel an order. If they're having trouble getting the satellite there on time, or the plane, or they can't post-process for whatever reason, it's okay to communicate, "Hey, that's no longer useful to me. Thank you so much," and move on. Because you don't want to keep eating up the time that you have on site, or the satellite sat phone time that you have, or the limited bandwidth that you might have on a remote location or on a ship, to do the work you need to do. All right. Lastly, manual interpretation. That's literally taking the before and after photos and comparing them. That can be the photos from yesterday and comparing them to today and seeing what has changed. Whether or not people are lining up at gas pumps in their cars to get fuel, whether or not 3 days ago there were cars moving around and now there are no cars moving around. That can be just as informative, depending on the time of day. If it's the middle of the day and there's no cars on the road and they're all pulled off on the side, chances are there's no more gas on the island. We ran into that in USVI, where in the first 3 days of the incident for Irma, we had cars going all around. They're lined up, for miles to get gas, and then 3 days later there were no cars on the road because either A, people didn't have enough fuel to get around, or B, they had gotten everything they needed and were at home. Those were two different interpretations of the same image. Now, when Maria hit 12 days later, there was another run on gas stations that indicated that the fuel had been restored in that intervening time, and so they were able to get back to gas stations. So different interpretations of that same info. We also, during Irma, we were able to identify that a solar farm and USVI was undamaged. It held up really well. It was awesome. And then Maria came in and the winds were coming from the opposite direction and ripped the whole thing out. So two separate instances of the same event of a very similar hazard can produce very different outcomes on the same critical infrastructure. So in the case of the previous volcanic eruption that has happened earlier this year, we can look at how that affected different critical infrastructure. And if we are planning ahead for a potential other incident, we can say, okay, this is how it fared last time. What are the other things that can go wrong? What are some preliminary imagery that we might need in that incident? And you can go ahead and write up a request ahead of an incident, put it in the file, get it ready to go, so that whenever you get on site and it's needed, or the incident happens, you can go ahead and put that request in, change the names and dates, and get those requests in. For various entities, the European Space Agency has provided me data in the past through, I just forgot the platform's name. It's a good one, and I will check my notes afterwards and include that link to it in this following this class. But there was a very particular form that I needed to fill out to get data from them, and I used the same PDF over and over and over again, where I had filled out all of my information on the first 3 pages, and it was the very last paragraph was the actual request of what specifically I needed from them, and that was all I filled out. So anytime that you can save yourself a little bit of time, you are saving operational time for the rest